What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Introduction to Comparative Politics. I hope that you are doing well and you've had a good week. I'm very happy to be with you this morning. We're halfway through a conversation about the state. And on Tuesday, if you'll recall, we primarily talked about the concept of the state. And we talked about how to measure the state and state strength. We talked about what states do and their functions and the ways that different state institutions promote the objectives of the state, implementing laws, creating and establishing order, and so on and so forth. This was a very conceptual and descriptive discussion, but it was very theoretical and even philosophical. We talked a lot about what states do and what the state is in a literal sense. Today, we're going to shift gears and begin having a more analytical discussion. We're focused now on explaining the formation of states and understanding systematically what causes them to originate, when and where and why they do. These are questions that will get us thinking about the European experience, but also the experience in the developing world and, well, what we call the developing world, the sort of non-Western world, if you will. These different experiences become very important because they help us to highlight the different causes of state formation and how the contexts vary substantially between the old sort of state formation in the old European world and state formation in the developing world. So this conversation is empirical, it's analytical, and it's going to be systematic. We'll be using our case study methods as well as using our concepts of state and state strength throughout this discussion. And our starting point is the question that you see before you right now, which is where and why do states originate? If we can think about the emergence of states in terms of historical time, where do we place this event or this episode? The truth is that the state is really the modern state. No state or association like it existed prior to about 1400 AD. There were a whole bunch of other associations, but none of these really approached the level of direct control and rule that we associate with the modern state, that political association that shares power over a given human community. Now, these other associations included, for example, tribute-taking empires, which would co-opt peoples, conquer them, and then tax them. Those associations included feudal lordships that were kinship-based and local. In these situations, lords would hire knights to defend the interest of the lord. This sometimes got awkward because knights would work for multiple lords at once, and so there would be conflicts of interest between the different knights. There was also the theocratic church, which ruled over and taxed its members in a kind of similar way that tribute-taking empires did. And then there were city leagues that were based on cities allying to form confederations to defend themselves and to group together to promote their interests. What all of these had in common is that they exemplified what we call indirect rule. These were associations based on alliances and personal ties. The rule was not direct, it was indirect. And this indirect rule stood in stark contrast to what we think about in terms of the state today. And so this is why we don't think of these early associations in terms of states. We think of them as other things. Just a reminder, everyone, try to remain muted if you can so we can avoid some of that ambient noise from the background. And these associations weren't just based on indirect rule, they also were not able to successfully monopolize violence. They didn't have the capacity in the level of control that was necessary to actually establish such a degree of authority. And so they were different from states of the modern kind, both in the sense that they were characterized by indirect rule and in the sense that they could not express or project authority sufficiently so as to monopolize violence. So you think about knights during medieval times, and you think about conflicts between lords who hire knights to defend them and their interests. And these are, common images that we've seen in movies and in art and in history. Those knights did represent part of a political association in the form of those lords who would hire them, but they never approached anything of the sort that we would associate with the state of the contemporary period, where we think of the military and the security forces and the police, all of which work to defend the power and the authority of the state. So the modern state is the state as we know it. The state as we know it is the modern state. And this modern state didn't just appear anywhere. It actually appeared in a very specific place at a very specific time. And that specific place was 12th century modern day Europe. This was a period where these kinds of political associations that existed in various forms that we just discussed began taking direct control of administration within a well-defined territory. Now, remember that this was a distinction from what took place before, which was characterized by indirect rule. The establishment of direct control and control of administration within a well-defined territory meant that there were much more direct and less mediated relationships between the administrative apparatus of these associations and the actual human communities themselves. In this process of establishing direct control began a transition from indirect rule to direct rule. And this process involved the centralization of power and the creation of a very clear bureaucratic hierarchy that established a line of authority and established relations of authority and power between different elements of the larger bureaucracy that formed the administration. And it was in this process of organizing domination that states emerged and began to solidify into what we know today. Now, this was a process that took hundreds and hundreds of years, but the key characteristic of the process was the transition from indirect to direct rule through the establishment of direct control, the centralization of power, the creation of a hierarchy and a bureaucracy, and then the organization of control within this territory. I'm going to check the chat because I think that we've got some comments here. Would Egyptian civilizations not be considered a state? I don't believe they would, not in the sense that we understand the state as an association that establishes a monopoly of violence within a given territory. I'm not able to speak about the fine-grained differences, so I'll leave it to someone else who maybe can. But in terms of our understanding of the state, we think of the state as principally a modern phenomenon. Anna Martha says, is the right of making laws with penalties of legitimate violence and death? Yes, exactly. So that's part of state power, right? The capacity of the state to inflict legitimate violence. And in this case, in some instances, states reserve the right to kill people if they prosecute them for certain crimes. And so, yeah, that falls under the rubric of legitimate violence because only the state has the capacity to use that violence. And so the modern state emerged in this process of organizing control in this transition from indirect rule to direct rule. Let's take a look at feudal France in about the 12th century. And what you'll see is that it's divided up into all of these different little units, all these little principalities and duchies and local centers of power that involve lords and knights and this constellation of actors who organize control, indirect control, in these smaller geographical areas. This was the beginning of the process of state formation in feudal France. This was the very, very beginning, where we start with the division of the geographic unit into all these little parcels, all these little principalities and duchies. Now, in the next several hundred years, a whole bunch of things began to take place. We've already discussed this transition from indirect to direct rule in the creation of these larger and larger centers of power and the concentration of power in the hands of these administrative apparatuses that represent associations that are able to establish direct control within a specific area. During this period of time, there was a lot of discussion about what was happening in Europe and the kinds of changes that were taking place. And one debate was about the appearance of what appeared to be states, or as Thomas Hobbes called it, leviathans, those actors who established direct control within a well-defined territorial unit. And Thomas Hobbes, in the Leviathan, which he wrote in 1651, wrote about this process, and he put forward one of the earliest theories of state formation. The question of why our states formed was of great importance to Thomas Hobbes, and his understanding of the process was as follows. He saw there being a universal problem in all instances. Always there is a tension between individual and collective interests. He described the state of nature between individuals and interests in society as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short because of this continual conflict and this continual tension between various actors. And Hobbes believed that because of this tension, humans needed government to avoid the dismal fate of conflict and destruction and death and bloodshed. And the solution, according to Hobbes, was the creation of what he referred to as a social contract, or an agreement between citizens to limit their individual freedoms in the name of creating a central authority that could sort of act as a referee and kind of impose order over the society of conflicting interests. The idea was that everyone accepts those limits and everyone accepts those constraints because the state binds everyone equally. And the contract is everyone is bound equally, and therefore all benefit equally from the establishment of order by the Leviathan. And according to Hobbes, the state is that entity that has the force to guarantee security and limit the tension between individual and collective interests. And so the earliest theory of the state and state formation was the theory of Thomas Hobbes, who said that the state is a product of the social contract forged between individuals in society to mitigate the tensions between individual and collective interests and to establish order and to impose order on a nasty and brutish state of nature. So this is an interesting and important idea because it set the tone for much of the rest of the discussion of the state. And in the background, Europe continued to solidify and consolidate those states that began to emerge and appear in place of all of those little principalities and duchies that I previously mentioned. So by the 18th century, the process has come to fruition, and Europe as we know it today is essentially the Europe that was in place at that time, with some important differences, but the broad strokes are already here by the 18th century. It's by this point that France and Germany and Italy and other European states have solidified their control within an administrative unit, a territory, and established and projected control throughout that place. And so, for example, we look at France, and France has transformed from a universe of tiny little duchies and principalities to something that is a unitary state with very, very absolute central control. This is the process of state formation, the transition from indirect to direct rule, and the establishment of administrative control within a territory. Now, the question of why states are formed is of perennial importance because we must understand and recognize that in the struggle between political associations to establish and solidify central control, there are always far more losers than there are winners. All of the states that exist today, France, Italy, Japan, etc., all of these states represent associations that won the competitive struggle between competing associations to establish a monopoly of legitimate violence. These victors are the exception, not the norm. The vast majority of associations that have existed throughout time have not successfully established this central control. And so why states form and why the establishment of central control takes place is a crucially important question. And the most important theory by far and the most common perspective on this question relates to the importance of war making. You know, the adage goes, war made the state and the state made war. War made states and states made war. That was said by Charles Tilly, who argued that wars were essential to the formation of European states because the conflicts between centers of power would result in winners forcibly annexing the loser's territory. The process was always quite similar. When you win a war, to the victor go the spoils, as they say. And in the case of European states, early on, winners would forcibly annex the loser's territory. And it was through this process of war making and continual conflict and continual annexation that these leviathans, these central administrative states, began to become more and more powerful and solidify their control over territories. Now, war also had indirect effects as well that were almost as important taken together as the annexation of territory. Those indirect effects included, for example, the creation of larger armies. To fight wars, you've got to create armies and create large standing militaries capable of defending and promoting, the interests that you're defending and promoting. So armies would get bigger and bigger and bigger the more and more European states fought wars. By the same token, European states also saw increases in the levels of taxation. They found that they were able to extract more revenue from society and from the public during times of war because the society and the public would perceive there to be a threat to the survival of the nation or the state. And so they would consent to higher levels of taxation so as to defend the nation and the state. And then on a similar basis, there was also the result of national unification. Because of this perception of threat, nations and groups would often unite and come together under the name of national defense. And this would help to promote the national solidarity that would help to legitimate the creation of a more and more powerful state. So war making was very, very, very important from the very beginning. And in Europe, it's impossible for us to understand the creation of the state without understanding the role of war making. But there are other causes of state formation besides war, and there are other ways that political associations would either merge or come together or establish wider and wider control in a given area. And I want to pause and pull back for a moment, and I want to ask you, what other causes of state formation might there be besides war? Is there some other cause that you can think of and that you wouldn't mind sharing with us in the chat? And I look forward to your input, which I'll incorporate here in a couple minutes after I give you just a moment to reflect on this question. Juan, can you explain that a little bit? That sounds very interesting. Juan says, religion can have a role. Having a particular set of beliefs can bring people together who also have the same beliefs. So we can imagine there being some cultural context or some cultural basis for the national unification that we might associate with state formation. I do want to encourage you to remember that, excuse me, nation formation is actually not part of the definition of a state. We think of the state in terms of a set of political institutions with legitimate authority. Now, the creation of a nation is often part of the state's project, but we need to connect the nation a little bit more closely to the institutions that we associate with the state as a part of politics. Alejandra says, trade can also bring people together and form connections and room for negotiation for power. Okay, good. So maybe trading relationships or some kind of agreement between two sides can help to facilitate their cooperation. Dorian says a cause of war can be political divides similar to the one that caused the US Civil War. Dorian, so let's think about a cause of state formation. So do those political divides affect the potential for the creation of a state? If we think of the state as a political association that shares power over a human community, I think that we can unravel that and learn quite a bit. Anna Martha says social relations, language, traditions, myths. Certainly. Kevin says a need or want for resources. Okay. So there could certainly be economic motivations. Valentine says another cause of state formation could be similar or different interests between each other. Good. Stephen says a need for a new political systems can lead to a new formation of a state peacefully if the current political system is failing. Revolutions can cause a war, says Aylin. And can revolutions cause the formation of a new state as well? That sounds like an interesting question that would relate to this discussion. Alexa says, would the colonies be examples of states or... So if we're talking about the US colonies before they declared independence, they would not be states. They would be basically, properties or extensions of the British crown in that example. We only think of states once they become sovereign, right? So remember that sovereignty is a key dimension of a state. That is, they make their own decisions. They're not subject to some external power. So a colony would not be a state because it's not sovereign. But so sovereignty is a key component. But Alexis, you could think about, the United States after the colonies declared independence and won the Revolutionary War, because that would be the period where the US state would be most formative and would be beginning to appear. So this question of what other causes of state formation might there be besides war, this is a tough question because the state is such a large apparatus in terms of its scope, in the magnitude of its activities, and its reach in society. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around what might bring about the formation of a state or a central administrative apparatus that establishes this direct control that we associate with the state. But there are some other causes besides war. And in a moment, I'll discuss some of those with you. And we're eventually going to take a look at some data and analyze some data and try to get a handle on what else might be going on in some cases that we'll select together. Let me read a couple more comments before I go forward and discuss some of these other causes. Jake says, would the threat of war count here? Maybe not actively being involved in one, but maybe the fear of war happening. Absolutely, Jake. The threat of war can often motivate states or countries to engage in military buildup or to expand the tax revenue base so as to prepare for a potential conflict. The need for solidarity can often become apparent to a society if they perceive themselves to be under threat or the potential for war. The threat of war can probably be as important as war itself. And possibly also because war can be quite exhausting and draining, whereas the threat of war might just help to build up the state without ever incurring any loss or any conflict. So that's a good idea. ISIS says unification. Some states unify with others in order to avoid war, share resources, the conservation of peace, and their own survival. Good, ISIS. That's so important. Pointing out that there could be alliances or some kind of unification between different associations or political associations or would-be states, if you will. That's so important. And I'm going to discuss that in a little bit more detail beginning now. Now, remember, we're still discussing the European experience. And don't worry, we're going to discuss the non-European experience in detail here shortly. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit more about some of these other causes of state formation. It wasn't just war making that contributed to state formation in Europe. Sure, war making was very important because of the taxation, creation of larger armies, and national unification. But there were also other decisions made in other outcomes of all sorts of processes that helped to create states as well. And some of those other processes were, for example, marriages and alliances between different associations or between different, duchies or principalities or different centers of power. So a good example is the marriage and the alliance of the Kingdom of France and the Duchy of Brittany. This helped to further solidify the central authority and power of what would eventually be the state of France. This alliance unified very powerful families, right? We're thinking about these old-timey royal families and these very, very powerful, noble lineages that come together and unify and therefore solidify their control and their administrative power. And they come together and they cooperate and they collaborate and they unify and they ally precisely because it's one way to solidify their power and their control. And so these marriages and alliances between powerful associations within a larger unit or larger kind of area or territory were also important in addition to war making when it came to the creation of states in Europe. And so these were always really, really, bougie and royal affairs. By definition, they were, because we're talking about the nobility, the marriages and the alliances forged and struck between these powerful, noble families in these powerful associations that had previously emerged on their own independently, but then came together in the form of these alliances and these marriages. So in Europe, this was really, really important. The kind of unification, as Isis put it, of these different actors and these different associations or centers of power that otherwise would have been separate and independent if not for their marriage or their alliance. Now, the process of state building in Europe was a process that extended across several hundred years. And as I told you, it really began as early as 1200 when the transition from indirect rule to direct rule through the establishment of direct control within an administratively defined area began taking place. That process extended all the way through the 19th centuries. And this process involved a continual centralization of power, a continual solidification of this kind of hierarchical authority over these territories and through the institutions set up by these states, these solidifying states. And these states centralized power by creating larger and larger bureaucracies. Now, bureaucracies are organizations with a clear hierarchy and dispersion of power through different branches of the organization that report to each other as part of a larger organization or a unit with command relations between the different levels of the organization. This is how states expanded and how they extended their control and centralized power and solidified their authority. It wasn't just that they won wars and extracted revenue and built armies and built nations. It wasn't just that they engaged in marriages and alliances. They also engaged in state building and institution building and the creation of systems and structures that would solidify and kind of entrench their power and their control. This is a process that took place throughout the several hundred years that spanned 1200 and the 19th centuries. I'm going to take a look at the chat here because someone's got something. Also in competition with others for their own preservation. Good, Anna Martha. Yes, so the competition with others, this kind of conflict or tension or struggle between the different associations who would be states if they could, but must prevail in the conflict between those different associations if they are actually to become states. So that competition is very, very important. You're also pointing out accurately that, hold on just a minute. Okay, that always happens. You're also pointing out accurately that competition between different states was also important because different states would seek to strengthen themselves relative to their competitors so that they can get advantages politically and economically and become more powerful. So that competition took place within would-be states between associations that came together or split apart, as well as among states that previously were composed of different associations. So there's competition of all sorts, and that competition is an important part of the process. Now, this process continued through the late 20th century and up until today. And from the late 19th century onwards, states took on a much broader set of functions. What began as a process of centralizing authority and solidifying power eventually began to give way to a focus on increasing fiscal extraction, confronting social needs produced by modernization and capitalist development, creating institutions of social protection so as to protect society from acute crises, um, propelling and propping up markets that periodically fail due to economic crisis, so on and so forth. States became much, much more engaged in the economy, in society. They identified specific objectives and goals that might help to promote the state's interests or the actors who control the state. And in general, during the 19th and 20th centuries, states became much more actively involved in everything. And this was a transformation from earlier periods when the state was more minimal. Both periods involved that direct control within a well-defined administrative unit or territory. It's just that in this later era, states became much more involved in reshaping and reformulating society in ways that states saw fit. This process of reformulation and transformation continues to this day. And in our most recent sort of historical era, we confront issues related to globalization in the state. And globalization is consequential because it tends to limit the capacity of states to make sovereign decisions and to act independently and act for themselves, not just because they have to cater to the interests of foreign capital, whom those states may rely on for investment, but also because they're enmeshed in all sorts of trading and economic and political relationships that they carry with them conditions and expectations that they have to meet, often in order to maintain all sorts of other situations and relationships that matter to them greatly. Also, there's the issue of the growing influence of IGOs that weaken state sovereignty. IGOs are international governmental organizations. These are entities that don't necessarily adhere to the boundaries of sovereignty or territoriality. By definition, they extend across borders and they represent, in some sense, a sort of kind of counterbalance to state power, precisely because of that lack of sovereignty and territoriality. So globalization presents the state with all sorts of challenges, and states are emerging and developing in fundamentally different contexts as a result of globalization. Even while it's still the case that globalization was a characteristic of earlier eras, the fact that states are so much more involved in society and the economy these days mean that globalization is much more consequential. Now, what we're going to begin to do is shift gears and focus on the experience of non-European states and non-European powers. No doubt you've noticed already that much of this discussion has been based on our understanding of Europe and what happened in Europe. That's because the earliest states appeared in Europe, not because other experiences don't matter. It's just the case that we can learn from Europe first and foremost because they were the earliest states to appear. But the creation of European states also meant the eventual creation of all sorts of other states, precisely because of the colonial ambitions of those European states. So between 1500 and 1900, these European powers that were continually expanding and centralizing their authority and their control began to demand more and more resources. And they used their newfound powers and their concentrated authority to form these global empires that were designed to enrich and strengthen and empower the colonial center. And during the process of these 400 years, these European powers colonized every corner of the non-European world, solidifying their control, extracting revenue and resources from these places. What this meant historically, and what this meant over the long haul, was that eventually the process of decolonization would produce new states, because the withdrawal of those colonial powers would mean the emergence of new sovereign republics. The process of decolonization really began in 1776 with the United States, but this process of decolonization is a process that continues to this day. There have been 4 waves of decolonization, or processes through which colonizers relinquish their colonies and permit them to become independent states. And those 4 waves are after the Napoleonic Wars, after World War I, after World War II, and after the Cold War. And the reason is because whenever you have a war, remember that the winner of the war will forcibly annex the territory of the other, but they will often also force the loser to relinquish their colonies or to liberate their colonies and let their colonies declare independence. This is often part of what we call victor's justice. So decolonization is closely linked to war, and war and decolonization go hand in hand to produce the emergence of new states throughout the non-European world. This process beginning in around 1776 and extending to this day in the post-Cold War period. And so the global domination of European states helped set the stage for the eventual withdrawal of European colonies and the creation of new states in the developing world. And so this process of state formation in the developing world was, relative to the European experience, late. It came later. It came after the European experience. These ex-colonies of European states are themselves becoming states. This process of decolonization, the withdrawal of the colonizer, the relinquishing of those former principalities and properties, and the independence of these new states. There were 51 UN members in 1945, and there were 193 in 2018. That gives you a sense of how much decolonization took place between the post-World War II period and the end of the Cold War. The post-Cold War period really stretching from the early 1990s to the present day. That's a radical transformation, and it gives you a sense of how tightly linked war and decolonization and state formation are in the developing world. But the developing world has had a fundamentally different experience with state formation than the developed world and the European world. And the most important difference that we have to identify first and foremost before we discuss this in a more detailed way is that many of these new states are of a different strength. Many of them are weak. Remember that we defined state strength as really the capacity of states to act, to pursue specific goals and objectives, given the constraints and the restraints imposed on them. It's really their capacity to do the things that states do, to serve the development and the security functions of the state. These new states in the developing world exist everywhere. They're all over the place, but they are of a fundamentally different strength. Many of them are weak. Now, before we continue, I'm going to pause and I want to ask you, what might be different about the creation of the state in Europe versus the creation of the state in Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia? What might be different about these different experiences? What happened in Europe that did not happen in Africa or Latin America? How can we understand the difference? Can you reflect on this and tell us a little bit about what distinguishes the two? I'm going to step back and I want you to provide your input. And I look forward to reading some of your comments and incorporating them as we go along. We'll discuss this in detail, but first let's see what you have to say. Stephen says, a difference may be their geography and the location of the new states forming, because it may be harder for the new government to get their resources through trade or get troops to a different part of the country if that need arises. Okay. Ian says, power in Europe has been formed for a relatively long period of time, so any new states in Europe have a groundwork or at least a model they can follow at an early age. Okay, good. Those are certainly all differences that emerge when we look at the cases. What might be different about the creation of the state in Europe versus other parts of the world? Can we get any other contributions? What's different about, say, state formation in Africa versus state formation in Europe? Jake says European countries played a role in inhibiting other developing states by expanding and taking resources. Absolutely. So one clear difference is that state formation in the developing world, the non-European world, took place in a context of post-colonial development. These were places that had been colonized and systematically exploited in most cases by European powers. Now, the type of colonial institutions mattered to whether or not they were exploited as badly as they were or were not. But the fact remains that late state formation in the non-European world took place in a post-colonial environment. That was not the case in European states. They were not former colonies. They themselves emerged as, all those little parceled out duchies and principalities. They were never colonies themselves. Anna Martha says the development of nationalism in Europe. Okay. Ian says maybe there are no existing political associations in Africa, but Europe and the Middle East are full of them. Interesting. So maybe there's a different proclivity towards associationalism in different regions or different areas. And maybe we'll find fewer associations in Latin America or Africa. Interesting consideration that could be. Kevin says, well, the terrain is the first thing because the Mediterranean is very unique. Their history, as well as a factor, Vikings, Rome, breaking the church, the original Martin Luther, the linkings between religion and government, centralization or buildup of cities, and quick industrial revolution when we got closer to the 1800s. Okay, so there were some important cultural and kind of socioeconomic differences, and maybe the focus on modernization is important. I'd wonder, did modernization and industrial revolution, did that come after formation of the state or before the formation of the state in Europe? Because 1800, remember, came near the end of that process of centralization of authority and power. But I wonder if you would see it possible for states and other places to bring about an industrial revolution, or if they're not established enough. Just a question. During their colonial high power, I thought, says Kevin. So the Industrial Revolution, yes, more or less. It came a little bit after the fact. It came a little bit late for colonialism. And in Latin America, for example, independence was declared in the 1820s, right? So the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that came way after independence had been declared in large parts of the developing world. So it varies. Africa obviously declared independence in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and so it varies from region to region. But let's not go down that rabbit hole. I've already done that a little bit. Nina says, I believe that creation of state is different in Europe because different territories in Europe are quite close in geography, thus causing more conflict, as the territories are more often to clash with one another. Interesting. So Nina is pointing out that it could be that there was more conflict and more war in Europe than in other places. Good point, Nina. Good point. I want you to really remember that, because that's going to become important in a moment when we take a look at some of the differences that emerge across the regions. Very good. Alexis says, perhaps the distinguishing factor is the organic development of statehood in European countries versus the necessity to rush the process in previously colonized or imperialized territories. Good, Alexis. It's especially difficult to form political institutions when these territories had been subjugated for a long period of time, and the dependence on the colonizing state may have led to confusion and disorganization when trying to avoid anarchy. Absolutely, Alexis. The fact that these late developing states in the non-European world were colonized is obviously hugely important, because it meant that they were already under the control of these systems that were external to them and that could really limit their development and change the timing and the sequence of all sorts of processes that might take place differently if they hadn't been colonized. And so you mentioned the rushing and the necessity of independence. That all sounds to me like independence in African countries, where independence was declared almost overnight as a result of decolonization in Africa, creating a whole set of new states that were very tenuous and fragile, and often in many cases weren't prepared to govern themselves, not because they weren't able to, but because of the condition they were left in by colonial powers who left behind all sorts of legacies of colonial rule. So that's really good, and I'm so happy that you would point this out. Alejandra says, Africa developed through trade and Europe developed through war for power. This is true, and the trading relationships that Africa developed through were mercantilist relationships that benefited the colonial power and at the expense of African countries. And so those relations of dependence meant that African states were left in a situation that was disadvantageous to them in their development once they actually became independent in the 1960s. And Kevin and Nina and Miguel agree with Alexis, and it's so good that we're on the same page here and that so many of us are in agreement or thinking in similar ways, because much of what we'll discuss ties into precisely what we just discussed in that input that I read to you. And the story of late state formation in the developing world is really a story of a totally different context than is the situation in those European countries of old. First and foremost, the military context is not the same. There are few interstate wars, there are many civil wars. So as was pointed out just a moment ago by many of you here in the class, in the new developing world, there is far less war making, and there are many more internal conflicts or internal wars that are fundamentally different than an interstate war that is waged between centers of power. What that means is that there's a splintering and a fragmentation that takes place within the state, and that weakens the central authority and the central administrative apparatus because it directly undercuts the capacity of the state to control the territory and to express power and project power. There's also a difference in the economic context. The truth is that most of these new states, these developing states, are poor countries, and they're often poor perhaps partly as a result of the legacies of colonial rule, and also perhaps because of the weakness of some democratic or some state institutions in the first place that were left weak or that were in some cases destroyed as part of a colonial project that left behind all kinds of legacies of destruction. This economic context is important is important as the military context, because it means that states aren't able to generate new sources of revenue and new sources of wealth. And poor states often have to tax exports, for example, and this is how they get their revenue. But the taxing of exports is really bad for the state because it weakens the economy and it makes it difficult to jumpstart economic growth. So the economic context is also important. The cultural context, at last, is equally important. And this is the fact that most of these new states inherited arbitrary boundaries. In Africa in particular, boundaries and borders were drawn by colonizers, not by the colonies themselves. The colonizers drew those boundaries and those borders to benefit themselves and to maximize the extraction of wealth and resources and revenue from the colonies. And so when those colonizers left behind those arbitrary boundaries, it meant that there was very little cultural and ethnic and racial and other forms of unity between groups within those societies. And what that meant was that it was difficult to form nations that could legitimate states and help to solidify some kind of central administrative state. This set of differences is so important because it helps us to understand how the developing world has had states develop differently than the European world. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quickly here. We've got a couple comments. What are arbitrary boundaries? Territory boundaries? Yes, Ian. So when I say arbitrary boundaries, I'm referring to the way in which the borders of the state or the country were drawn. In Africa, for example, borders were drawn essentially arbitrarily. They were drawn by colonizers, and they were drawn to benefit the colonizer, and often as part of negotiations between different European powers who had colonies in Africa. And so the way in which those borders were drawn was arbitrary in the sense that it didn't respect any of the ethnic diversity or racial or religious or other diversity that existed in the place. So a lot of countries have lots and lots of different ethnic groups, lots of diversity that can sometimes make it difficult to support democratic institutions. Is that the same thing that happened in the Balkans? I don't know a lot about the Balkans, but the Balkans are certainly an example of diversity and the heterogeneity within countries that can sometimes lead to tensions and civil conflicts. Essentially the same thing. A lot of the internal wars in developing countries that weaken states in developing countries do relate to ethnic tensions. And so it is similar to the situation in the Balkans, or even all the way from the Balkans to Africa. I won't say more about the Balkans because I just don't know enough about them to compare, but it's essentially similar, I think, in terms of the ethnic diversity and how it can affect state formation and conflict. So let's take a look at the non-European world and the European world alongside each other, along these different variables. We've got 4 different variables that all have been linked to state strength, and in particular, state weakness. And those variables are as follows. Is the state reliant on foreign powers? Reliance on foreign powers can weaken the state by itself and prevent the state from becoming stronger and strengthening and solidifying central control. Is it a former extractive colony? That is to say, did a European power set up extractive institutions for the purpose of extracting revenue and wealth from that society? If yes, that can help to weaken the state because it sets in motion a pattern of institutional development that is very regressive and unproductive and detrimental to the overall sort of establishment of central control within that society. Are those borders drawn arbitrarily by colonizers seeking to maximize gain, or are those borders drawn non-arbitrarily? That's another difference between the non-European world and the European world. The type of war, at last, is a key difference. Civil war predominated in the non-European world. Interstate war predominated in the European world. And these different variables all correspond to different hypotheses and sort of perspectives on state strength and state formation across the European and the non-European worlds. Now, this is very rough, and there are deviations from both categories in both regions. There are weak states in Europe. There are strong states in the non-European world. But generally speaking, this is the sort of set of differences between the two types of states, if you will, that we see over and over. And what we're going to focus on as we go forward is one of these variables and one of these factors in particular, which is the type of war. And the type of war is incredibly important because of, well, things that we'll discuss. But I first just want to highlight the difference here in the data so that we can see for ourselves the distinction between the non-European world, as in Africa, Latin America, Asian countries, in the European world, Western Europe, Northern Europe, you know the usual offenders. And that difference is the type of war. The non-European world, African countries, Latin American countries, these countries experienced disproportionately civil war. They didn't experience a lot of interstate war. They had internal conflicts, as we pointed out in previous slides. Now, the European world, by contrast, was largely affected by interstate war. The wars that were fought were wars between centers of power, not wars within centers of power. And this is an important distinction, and one that we suss out much further in the literature in comparative politics. And I want to pause, and I want to put it to you and anyone who wants to share or reflect on this for a moment. Why might civil war fail to stimulate state formation, even if interstate war does? What is it about civil war that is different than interstate war? And how is it that civil war contributes to state weakness, even if interstate war contributes to state strengthening. Does anyone have any ideas about how this might be the case, or why civil war might fail to stimulate state formation? Alejandra makes the important point: in a civil war, the country loses either way because it's fighting within itself. Yeah, so by definition, the civil war, it brings about this fragmentation, right? Or this splintering, the kind of parcelization of the whole country into these little pieces who fight each other in a conflict. It, by definition, involves fragmentation. Stephen says civil war is people within a state fighting against themselves, and interstate war brings the country together to fight towards a common goal. Good, good. So clearly, within a country, a civil war involves people fighting against each other. Outside of a country, an interstate war involves nations fighting each other, and so coming together against a common threat or a common enemy. Kevin says it means that one section group ideology that lives inside the state has lost, and there is a winner from another section group or ideology. Yeah, so by definition, that's an important point too. Good, Kevin. Kevin's pointing out that not only is it fragmentation within the state that results from civil war, there's also a loser, or there's also one side that is essentially defeated and is in some way set aside or separated from the other side after the civil war itself. So it causes this splintering. There's always going to be a loser, and that doesn't help to forge a national consensus or help to promote state building. That helps to break down state building. Efren says in civil war, many factors such as the political ideology, ethnic diversity, religion might break states from forming. For example, the Korean War led to the formation of two states, North and South Korea. Yeah, absolutely. The example of North and South Korea is a good one and shows how civil war literally can lead to the breakdown of states and the separation of two sides and the end of what was previously a single state. Alexis says, there's a sense of unity when a state goes to war with another state. The public is meant to unite in order to achieve victory, but victory in a civil war means only that the split between multiple ideologies is exacerbated and the victor is not a representative of the public as a whole. Good, good. That's an excellent point, Alexis. The victor is not a representative of the public as a whole. By definition, there are these two sides, right? Or maybe even more than two sides. And that breakdown and that failure of representation is problematic from the vantage point of the strengthening of the state, which usually relies on, forging unity and solidarity. All of these things are important considerations, and I'm so happy that we're really thinking about this and thinking through the way this works. Let's take a look at what I have. Now, why might civil war fail to stimulate state formation, even if interstate war does stimulate that state formation? If interstate wars lead to larger armies, a rise in the levels of taxation and national unification, then civil wars really do the opposite. As we've pointed out in the chat, as a group, civil war tends to lead to long-term or permanent territorial losses through fragmentation. So some areas go one way, some areas go the other way. And the fragmentation that occurs can contribute to territorial losses and the splintering and the breakaway of different areas of what was previously a state under one central administration. It's also the case that civil wars lead to the creation of smaller armies because of that same fragmentation and that splintering away, that breakdown, that kind of taking of sides that occurs among different villages or communities or parts of the country. And then, of course, a fall in the levels of taxation also results from this same fragmentation. So in developing countries, civil wars are more common than interstate wars, but what that means for state formation is incredibly important. It means that state formation is going to occur fundamentally differently. Those states are going to always, generally speaking, be weaker as long as civil war was more common than interstate war, because those civil wars will lead to territorial losses, the creation of smaller armies, a fall in the levels of taxation. And all of those are dimensions of state strength or state weakness that we've elaborated and conceptualized this week. I'm going to take a look at the chat really quickly because we've got a comment from someone. Open a political space to share power. So civil war affects state building in a fundamentally different way. And it does so by affecting territoriality, the creation of armies, and the levels of taxation that create streams of revenue for the state. But here's what's really interesting. There's more to the story. The question of how robust the link between interstate war and state building actually is an important question. Because if you look at some developing countries or some non-European states, you'll find that though they experienced interstate war, they did not necessarily strengthen or fully form as states. And one example I give you is the comparison of Vietnam and Afghanistan. And this is where we begin to examine some of the limits of the existing perspectives in the literature. If it's true that war making causes state making, Afghanistan should be a stronger state than it is, but it's not. It's a weaker state. In Vietnam, it does appear to be the case that interstate war has corresponded with stronger state building and more robust state formation. This distinction is very interesting because it makes us pause and wonder, is there something else going on beyond a simple role for interstate war that could help us to explain why Afghanistan is a weak state? And so the question arises, why might interstate war fail to stimulate state creation in Afghanistan, even if it stimulated state creation in Vietnam? To put it a different way, what else went on in Europe that didn't go on in Afghanistan? What else took place in Europe that helped to contribute to state building through war that did not take place in Afghanistan? Are there other conditions that are required for state building that we're not picking up on in this very simple comparison between the old world and the non-European world? I want to ask you, and again, use the chat. If you've got an idea and something comes up, please tell us. I'll incorporate your input, and here in a moment, we'll take a look at the data and we'll analyze and evaluate the data and consider some other variables that could be important. We've already got some contributions coming in hot. Ian says religion, maybe the cleavage around Sunni versus Shia. Alexa says interstate trade relations, religious tolerance, or similarity. Good, good. We're already thinking about some of the variables that could be at work here and that could help to kind of intervene between war and state making, and that could help to explain the rest of the story in the non-European world. Stephen says whether or not those states had to rely on other states for their main resources. Okay. What else? Alexa says intervention by other states in their political affairs. So that's an interesting point, Alexis. I think it's fair to say quite easily that both these countries experienced outside intervention. And that intervention dovetailed with those interstate wars, obviously. But remember that we're using the method of difference. And so we might be looking for a difference between these cases that could help to account for the variation in the state strength. So if they both experienced outside military intervention, that might not be what differentiates the cases. But that's a really important, I think, part of the story that will come into the narrative in important ways. Alejandra says Vietnam is coastal, Afghanistan is surrounded on all fronts. Interesting point. Could be something with the geography and how that affects the capacity of the central government to project power. That's something that is part of our discussion and debate in comparative politics when it comes to state building. Kevin says, the difference is how and who was the outside intervention. Okay, interesting. So maybe not just the fact of intervention, but also the identity of the intervener, as we'll say. Other ideas about what might account for the difference between these similar cases. Jake says maybe the strength of the intervention against Vietnam versus the strength of the intervention against Afghanistan. Okay, so I see that the intervention variable seems relevant to this discussion, and that many of us wonder about the possibility of a role for military intervention in shaping state formation and the trajectory of state formation. We'll see in a moment whether that does or doesn't appear in the data that I have for you that does come from a study on the same issue. Let's take a look at what I've got here. So when it comes to war and state making in the developing world, and when it comes to using the method of difference to compare Vietnam and Afghanistan, there are a couple other variables that become relevant to the relationship between interstate war and state building. Remember that the original hypothesis was war making causes state making, in that it's a relatively direct relationship as well as an indirect relationship based upon a few different factors that are set in motion by the war itself. But what Vietnam and Afghanistan tell us is that in the developing world, as in Europe, there may have been an important role for two additional variables that made it so that the war making had the effect that we expected it to have. The first variable is the existence of a core ethnic group that had already established some national solidarity and some basis for nation building in the future. So in the absence of a core ethnic group, it was more difficult to take advantage of interstate war as a basis for creating the state. And so, for example, in Afghanistan, there was no core ethnic group. There was quite a bit of diversity ethnically and religiously. And that meant then that there wasn't a pre-existing national foundation upon which the state could be built. In Vietnam, by contrast, there was a core ethnic group, and that made it possible for war to kind of be taken advantage of as an opportunity to gain the support and embolden that national sentiment that already sort of existed. It was also the case that the combination of war and revolution proved to be important. In Afghanistan, there was no revolution. There was no political and social and economic uprising and prolonged effort to transform the system. There was no revolution. And so though there was an interstate war, there was no political revolution to complement the war or that went alongside with or prompted the war in the first place. In Afghanistan, in Vietnam, by contrast, there was. And this combination of war and revolution worked together along with the existence of a core ethnic group to lead to state strengthening and state formation through interstate war. And so what I'm telling you is that in the developing world, even in those cases where interstate war did take place, there were other factors that had to obtain before that interstate war could produce the outcome of state formation that we expected to produce based on our understanding of the European experience. And what I want to tell you moreover is that it's likely that many of the European cases also required the existence of a core ethnic group as well. Perhaps not a revolution, but the point is a good one, which is that interstate war alone may not be enough to guarantee state formation. You may need some core ethnic group, and you may need some political activity that combines with the war or the conflict that can help to produce the state strengthening that we expect. This is a way for us to understand divergent experiences in the developing world. And this is a way for us to use the method of difference to compare similar cases and try to figure out, well, to what extent does war actually cause state making? And are there other variables that matter as well that have to be considered in the analysis? What this tells us is that there are other variables that have to be considered in the analysis. And so, as before, when we approach data like this, we ask ourselves, in what ways are these cases different, and what causal inferences can we draw from the data? And then finally, at last, it forces us to consider whether we need to qualify the claim that war made the state and the state made war. And it does force us to qualify that claim. It forces us to consider what other factors have to obtain for interstate war to produce the outcome of state formation that we expect it to produce. And so in the final analysis, we can reach a few conclusions about these cases. We can say a few things about state formation. So what we can say is that Vietnam and Afghanistan differ in core ethnic group in the combination of war and revolution. Only Vietnam had those two factors. Interstate war, core ethnic group, and war plus revolution appear to combine to facilitate state building in the developing world. That is to say, interstate war alone is not enough. You need more than interstate war to produce state building. Interstate war must combine with the existence of a core group in the combination of war and revolution to produce the state building that we expect it to produce based on our understanding of the European experience. In the final analysis, what this tells us is that the European and non-European experiences may be similar in some ways, but they may also be quite different in some ways as well. And this tells us then that all cases have to be examined on their own merits. And we have to always scrutinize these hypotheses. And we've got to examine and evaluate the data and find out if those patterns really emerge across the cases as we expect them to, or if they depart from expectations and suggest that there may be something else going on that makes the picture more sophisticated or more complex. And so we are pretty much done. We've got 1 minute left, and I am happy to take questions or comments, but we are done. And so you are free to go if you feel content and satisfied with today's lecture. Otherwise, I'll stick around and you can use the chat and you can use the mic to talk to me. But I hope that you have a very nice weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.